So today's topic, we're going to be talking about GAMSAT Section 1. So unfortunately, Felicity and I are neither tutors for Section 1, but we did sit the exam ourselves, as evidenced by the fact that we are in med school, and we did well enough to get through. So we'll talk generally about what Section 1 will entail, our personal experiences with Section 1, how we approach study for the exam ourselves, and then we'll talk about some kind of examples of question types and topics that you'll likely see on the day. But let's talk generally about Section 1 and what it entails. So it's part of the humanities component. So as you probably know, Section 1 humanities, Section 2 technically humanities, essay writing, Section 3 sciences. And that's really all you get to prove yourself on the GAMSAT. So Section 1 is multiple choice questions. So things may change. They have changed in the past. There's nothing saying that this is going to be the way that it is in the next few years. So look at the information guide. Obviously, that's going to be your Bible as to what to expect on the day. So what that means as a reading time is you're not allowed to write at all. So obviously, if you're sitting it on the computer, which has been the way of the world recently, you can't write anyway. You can't click answers as far as I know. You can't write on your scratch paper. That is purely reading things off of the computer screen or off of the piece of paper if that's how you're sitting the exam. Following that 6-minute reading time, you got 64 minutes to write. So you can click things, you can write on your scratch paper, whatever you need. You have, give or take, about 90 seconds per question. So when you're doing your practice exams and when you're kind of studying through, that's the time that you should be budgeting per question. It's a really difficult thing to try and chug through, and it's really important to keep that in the back of your head. It's really important to try to keep track of that as you go through. So Felicity, did you have a timekeeping mechanism throughout, or how do you kind of manage your time throughout?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate what you said. You miss 100% of the questions you don't answer. So that is a really important thing to make sure that you're keeping time all the time. I think also within Section 1, you've got to realize that questions come in clumps as well. And so while a lot of the time is like spent looking at a text, you have to then realize that because you're reading that text for so long means you have even less time to answer the question. So and some questions will take longer, some will take shorter, and kind of like keep a sort of balance in your head as to where you're at. So you're like, okay, I only took 10 seconds to answer that last question. I have a little bit more time to answer these next questions, but obviously motor. And if you spend as little time as possible on these questions, obviously within reason and making sure that you answer them correctly, you'll have more time, hopefully at the end, to like go back through and figure out what you have answered properly and what you haven't. So yeah, that's mine. I guess within Section 1, it's also made, as I was talking about, it's made up of different texts. So interpreting news articles, poetry, journal articles, opinion pieces, political satire, cartoons. It really could be any sort of form of anything that you can interpret and read. And that's what you'll be faced with. And then the questions will be about your comprehension of that text and how well you have read it and how well you've understood and grasped the idea that the writer is trying to get across. So yeah, you have to, I guess, make sure that you are getting the right idea, and we'll go into, I guess, a few more tips on how to do that later, but then you'll have a multiple choice with 4 answer options, and you have to choose often the most correct or sometimes the least correct answer. And this is a really difficult thing because, like, we'll go into it later again, but the 4 answers that you'll get can often be really similar or often be somewhat right in some ways. So it makes Section 1 a bit of a challenge when you're doing it in the GAMSAT.
Yeah, and I think, the most correct thing is probably a really frustrating thing for people who come from a sciences background, because typically in science, there is a right and there is a wrong answer. And unfortunately, with Section 1, there can commonly be multiple right answers. It's just which one fits the case. And, this may look, hopefully you guys have done some practice questions by now, but this may look like, in the text, what is the best definition for the following word? And then they'll have a word, and then you can find it in the text and figure out what the definition is based on the surrounding context clues. But all the words might be similar,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My favorite / most frustrating question is like, what is the person in the text feeling? And then they've got 4 synonyms for happy, and you're like, they're all happy. What are you talking about? But you have to really like try and find the difference between all those words, and it can be really annoying.
Yeah, and probably the best thing is to not get bogged down. If you're not sure, just guess and move on, because you're going to bash your head over the desk if you try to spend too much time. So understand that as a science person, you might not have a really strong field in this section, but it is something that you can get better at with a bit of practice and with some exposure. So probably just exposing yourself to that, like Felicity said, news articles, poetry, journal articles, opinion pieces, just to get an idea of what to expect and how to read these type of things and what type of mindset to have in the back of your head as you're going through these different types of text is really important. So we've talked about the section 1 generally. Maybe we should talk about our own experience. So I guess talking generally about how we studied prior to the exam, the type of materials used to study, how to approach the section on the day, what was difficult, what was maybe easy, and if we want to, our own outcomes on it. So Felicity, do you want to start talking about your section 1?
Yeah, sure. So my section 1 was my strongest section, because I am not a science person. And I've always been way more leaning towards the arts and feelings and sensitivity and all those kinds of things. But I think that's something that I really had in my favor with regards to section 1 is I've been reading since I was a little kid, and it meant that I am able to read at extreme speeds, which meant that I had a lot of time to process the questions and answer them to the best of my ability. Obviously, if you're not a speed reader like I am, it's okay. You can still get through this section as well. I think if you've got months to prepare, like maybe not if you're sitting the September one this year, but if you've got a year or months to prepare, trying to read faster is something that is worthwhile, because again, like we were saying, time is kind of your worst enemy in this particular section, and it can really, really help take the pressure off if you don't have to think about time so much. Whenever I came across a question in section 1, I would skim the passage quickly and then read all the questions and the answers closely, and then I would go back to the passage and read the passage closely, specifically maybe jumping to parts that address the question. Then with the particular question itself, I would underline it, and then I would also underline the answer that I had chose. Obviously, if you're doing it on this computer, that can be a bit difficult. I'm not sure if they have like little highlighty things, but making sure that you are reading the question properly, because I feel like a lot of problems come from misreading like most correct or least correct, and they really do try it. They can try and trick you by putting the answer to what they think you might have read in the question. And you can also answer via the process of elimination if you're really not sure about it. So you're like, no, that person doesn't seem happy, that person doesn't seem content, or whatever. And you find contradicting information in the passage to support that elimination as well. And it's probably the most accurate way of getting the right answer. It just can be a bit time consuming if you do the process of elimination. If you're time poor and there are often within 4 answers, there are like 2 that are kind of a little bit off base, and then 2 similar answers. And you're, 20 minutes before finishing and you've still got 12 questions left, I would say still read the text, still go through all that process. But if you've got 2 answers that you're trying to choose between, go with your gut. A tip that I was really given is you have to think with your most optimistic self in the exam. And if they're like, is this person feeling angry or happy? And it's really hard for you to tell for whatever reason, choose the more optimistic answer. That's just a general tip I picked up along the way, which seemed to have worked for me. So that's good. Um, Another thing that I used to prepare is, I'm not sure if you're in New South Wales, there used to be these ICAS exams or UNSW exams that were run by the University of New South Wales that we did in like year 6, year 7, kind of all the way up until year 12, and they were comprehension tests. And I think that they had some really, really great passages there, that you can practice reading through, and then comprehension questions to answer. The questions are a lot easier than what you would expect from the GAMSAT exam, but I think that the style of the questions is very similar. So using that to your advantage as well. Obviously, I used a lot of past GAMSAT papers. I bought all of the ones I could, and then seeing if there are any other resources out there on the internet floating around as well. It's always worth a Google. So yeah, that's how I tackled section 1 personally. What about you, Nick?
Yeah, I probably have a bit of a different idea of tackling questions than you do because I, I can read quickly, but I'm the type of person that when it comes down to it, when I'm reading for fun, we'll say, if I get to the end of a page, 9 times out of 10, I'll go, what did I read on that page? I don't even remember the words of what I actually read. I just skimmed the text without actually, putting any of it into my brain. So for me, I can read fast, but it's not always efficient. So much like how I do section 3, I read the question first and the answers first to try to get an idea, because in section 1, a lot of times it will say in line 13. And so from there, straight away, oh, cool, I'm going to go straight to line 13. So it's a lot of what best fits the feeling of what they're talking about in line 13 when they say, disgruntled or something like that. And so for me, I would read the question. I'd find that in the stem or in the passage. I would look about 1 second before and 1 second after, and I'd read that. Because a lot of times all they're asking you to do is get a bit of context clues. Unfortunately, that will bite you a little bit in the fact that a lot of times there are questions that say, what's the general meaning or the tone of the passage? So in that instance, a lot of times you do have to at least have a really good understanding of the whole passage as an entire piece. You can't just read 1 or 2 lines. But in saying that too, a lot of times that's the last question that's asked, or one of the last questions. So by the time you've answered 3 or 4 questions before, you do have a pretty good feel of the piece as a whole. So again, different sides of the same coin. Obviously, we both did fine in our own right. Section 1 for me wasn't my strongest section. The sciences was, but it was above section 2. So for me, it's one of those things that you have to play to your strengths, and you have to know how you run the exam and what your best method of testing is. So if you don't know that, start reading, start doing practice questions, see if you're a fast reader. If you can smash out a passage really quickly and understand it really well, maybe it's worthwhile spending 20 or 30 seconds at the start, really understanding what the passage is telling you so that it'll give you a guided method of approaching the questions. But like I said, for me, a lot of it came down to 90% of the passage you don't need. It's only that 10% that they're asking you about that you actually need to understand. So for me, reading the whole passage was really almost a bit of a time waste. And so, but again, section 1 is one of those classically that most people do get through all the questions because you're fresh. It's a few less questions. Yes, it's a bit less time per question, but like we were saying, a lot of it can come down to gut feeling or a bit of guesswork. And so sometimes you can just say, look, I've spent 60 seconds on this question. I'm just going to put an answer. I'm going to move on. So you can move through it a bit quicker than what you might be able to move through section 3, depending on your background. So I think it's knowing yourself, it's doing practice questions. And that's really what I did before. In saying that too, it's really important not to neglect things, because I am absolute case in point of the fact that I focused so much on section 3 because I was told, oh, it's double weighted and, it's the biggest section, it's the longest and it's the hardest. So you really need to put time in that. And I really probably didn't do anywhere near enough for section 1 and section 2. And so you can't forget them, because if you get below a 50 on any section, your score is effectively null for almost every school in Australia. So you have to at least get a good enough score that you're competitive with universities overall, but you also have to get a good enough score per section. So something like section one is one of those tricky things that it kind of feels like, oh, I'll do a bit of prep in the last month before the exam. And it's really a very risky thing to make that decision. So I think, start studying early. You don't have to study long. You don't have to study hard, but start to read a few passages, start to read a bit of poetry, start to read a few news articles, and even, kind of getting good at, after you read something, say, okay, what was the main point of that?
Yeah.
What did I find? What did I learn from it? What was the feeling? Was it, was it a limerick? Was it a, I don't know enough poetry. I don't know why I said limerick because
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
What was the tone? So that's, that's a really important thing and a skill that you can build.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take much time. It can be built over time. So, and, similar to what Felicity said, I just use very kind of simple resources. I used a lot of online exams, online news articles, online papers. A lot of that stuff's free access. So you don't really have to dive too deep to get too much. And section on the day, I think for me, it was just about trying to move through efficiently. Again, knowing my ability and where my strengths were as far as reading the question first and then finding the information in the stem. And then if I couldn't figure it out, then maybe doing a quick skim of the entire stem. But that was kind of my step-by-step process of what I did. And honestly, section one, I don't want to say it in a bad way, but for a lot of people, I think it's more of a barrier thing. It's more of that's the first 90 minutes of the day. You're fresh, but it's like, I think most people really set their sights on section three, which is what I was guilty of too. But it's the idea that section one and section two is a get through lunch, and then section three is a survive. And I think that is kind of how a lot of people see it, whereas it's really important to understand that section one is just as important. And if you get a average-ish score on section three, your section one and section two scores can really make a difference to your overall score as a whole. So if you are neglecting those things, it's not going to carry you through at the end of the day. And they can carry your section three score down as well.
Yeah.
So I think for me, the difficult part was in the studying because I didn't spend enough time on it. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I did okay, but it's really important not to neglect that kind of stuff. So do you think that's kind of common across the board, Felicity, for people to forget about section one and two?
Yes, totally. Because I feel like a lot of people who do sit the GAMSAT do come from science backgrounds, and they're like, this is my strength, this is what I can, and because the answers have the questions have actual answers that are very concrete, it can often be seen as something that it's easier to improve in. But like you're saying, you can improve in this. Wide reading is important as long as it's focused wide reading with analysis afterwards and asking yourself those questions afterwards. Even just like improving your vocabulary is really important. And I had a bit of I think you tend to study firstly, what you think you can improve on, secondly, what you think you're good at and you're like want to play to your strengths sort of thing. So I almost had like the opposite sort of study technique to Nick, in which that I spent a lot of time on section one and section two because those were my strengths. And I spent an adequate amount of time on section three. And then in the end, they were all like, I got pretty high scores all across the board. And so it kind of all evened out sort of thing. I wasn't ever expecting to do amazingly in section three, but being able to focus on section one and two was really, really good for my score in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we've said it plenty of times before, but the GAMSAT is a tactical thing. So you play to your strengths, you play to what's going to serve you the best. When you're applying to schools, you play to how the schools actually look at your application, where they weight GAMSAT versus GPA, and where your strengths are as a student. So unfortunately, to get in, a lot of it can be a bit tactical, but that's why we're talking about all this stuff, to try and get you into that mindset of thinking about how you're going to approach your study, how you're going to approach the exam, how you're going to approach applications. It's all really important to kind of, play to your strengths. So maybe I think the next bit here, we can talk about some questions and types of questions that you'll see in section one. So I think the big thing to keep in mind here is that this list is by no means exhaustive. So there's anything that they could ask you about. They could literally pull any text. It could be a news release, it could be a journal article, it could be a cartoon piece. It could be anything really. It doesn't even have to be words. It could purely be a picture. So I think the idea here is spread yourself far and wide as much as possible. But we'll talk about a few things, I think, and maybe we'll just take turns back and forth between the different subjects, and we can add a bit of pieces here and there as we kind of think of them. But probably where we can start is poetry, because I think that's a place where people really struggle. It's not I don't know, it's hard because it's not an overly complicated way of getting information across, but it can be quite difficult to piece apart if you're not used to reading poetry and you're not used to understanding the different formats and how they can be utilized to get a different point across. So without further ado, I guess, talking about poetry, it's one of those things that and we'll probably say this multiple times in the next couple minutes, but exposure is the best way to go. The more you read, the more you see, the better you'll get at breaking it down. It's almost like another language to a degree, where it's a different format of English. It's a different way of speaking. It's a different way of writing. It's a different way of getting a point across. There's a lot of metaphors. There's a lot of similes. There's a lot of, kind of likenesses. They're not telling you explicitly what's going on. They're trying to give you a feel for broadly what's going on. So you can say, they're not talking about this, but I can tell they're actually talking about this.
Yeah.
So exposure is really important. Different types of poetry is good. Like I said, limerick was the thing that I came up with, which is not very helpful because they're, I think, usually quite short. But there's a lot of different options. No? Am I completely wrong?
No, you're right. I just can't imagine that. Imagine a limerick in the GAMSAT, like, there once was a boy from Kent. He would always see where he went. Like, it's just like the most basic form. It would be like, I would almost prefer a haiku to a limerick in the GAMSAT, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll maybe say that there's not going to be too many limericks on the GAMSAT, but there will be some format of other poetry at least. So
I think with poetry, what's really important for me is to, if possible at all, like when I was sitting the GAMSAT, we were in a big hall. I would just mutter very, very quietly under my breath and read the poem out loud to myself, because sometimes you can get a lot from the cadence of the poem. Actually, I don't know if this is particularly time important, but if the question is what's the overall feel of the poetry, and you've got some very heavy syllables in there, as opposed to a light lilting pattern and rhythm to the poem, it can give you a massive idea of whether it's a satirical poem as opposed to a really depressing poem. And it can be really difficult to separate the two sometimes. So that's my big point in poetry. And then also, like what Nick was saying, metaphors, similes, but in poetry, words tend to be chosen much more precisely than in prose. And so as a result of that, sometimes words have double meanings as well. And that can be really difficult when interpreting the tone of a poem. So making sure you have paid attention to that. And like Nick said, read as many poems as you can, and then follow that up with asking yourself questions about those poems, so that you really consolidate that skill of being able to interpret poetry.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of resources out there to find poems. So, just a quick Google will get you there. But just some lists that I've heard from other Section 1 tutors that have actually, they know more about what they're talking about. But poetryfoundation.org is a resource where you get lots of different types of poetry. You can go through lists and kind of find out a bunch of different types of poetry. So Schmoop, SCHMOOP.com or SparkNotes.com. I think a lot of those even have reviews from people. So they have the poetry, or they have a very explicit kind of review of saying, this is what I got from the poem. This is the type of poem it is. This is what the author was trying to talk about. This was the background of the author's life when this was happening. Yeah. So what you can do in that is you can read the poem, say, off poetryfoundation.org, and then go to those other websites and look at the review after you've maybe written your own. So you read the poem, write a bit of a review, say, okay, what did I learn from it? What do I think the tone was? Maybe even pick a couple words and say, okay, if I had to take my best guess, what would I say that those words actually mean in the text, as a general feel? And then go to those reviews and say, okay, did I get it right? Did I nail it? How far was I off? If I, and don't stress too much if it's like, oh, the person was elated versus happy. Those are kind of very small differences, which, if you're writing a general review, they're not going to be all that important. But if you wrote down that the person was happy and the theme of the poetry was depression, you probably have missed the mark somewhere. So that's where you maybe go back and you say, okay, what didn't I get? What did I miss? What did I read? What was kind of confusing for me? Is there something that I can then do to improve it the next time I read through? Or did I miss facts or words that I didn't quite understand, and because of that, I got the feeling completely wrong? So it's a big block of things to get through. But again, like, you don't have to do a lot. If you do a couple a day or even a couple a week, especially if you have kind of 6 months to study, obviously it depends on how far it is until you sit the GAMSAT. But if you do a couple a day, that's enough exposure over time that you do start to get really good at it. And I think you'd surprise yourself how quickly you can improve at something like this, because it is it's a skill. You can build the skill over time.
That's a really good study technique, Nick, for basically any sort of text or form of section 1 question that we're going to go through. So everyone write that down. If you have heaps and heaps of time, like you're one of those people who have started preparing for the GAMSAT at the end of their first year of university, then even if you have those texts, then after you finish reviewing it, writing yourself a multiple choice question that you can refer back to later is the ultimate way to study, and ultimate way to have a bank of questions that you can practice with. And if you're so willing, share with other people who might be going through the same thing as well. Yeah, amazing. Okay, so let's move on to cartoons. Often a really daunting sort of text, because people are like, what can I get from this stick figure picture? And the answer is a lot. So it's important to really look over the whole image, taking in the foreground, the background, any color tones, and any included text. So often there'll be a caption belowhand or a speech bubble or something like that. And then to recognize that every cartoon that they're giving you has a purpose, and you have to figure out what that purpose is before you answer the question. So parody, sarcasm, could be irony, it could be a call to action, social statement, it could be really any sort of thing. And I think, even though I said you can get a lot from a cartoon, there's only really ever going to be a maximum of 2 questions on the cartoon. And usually one of them will be, what is the vibe of this cartoon? And so that's why you have to look at the entire image. And if you are really stuck looking at these things and you're like, I have no idea what this means, or it's referring to some sort of political scenario that you aren't across, or you're not sure about, like if it were referring to climate change, for example, I think the best thing to do is to really, this is my tip, but really look at the facial expressions on the little people, and see what the person has drawn. This is only if you're really, really stuck and you just can't figure it out, but their facial expressions, and choose what you think based on those facial expressions. Yeah, that's my tip for cartoons. What about you, Nick?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of kind of just assessing what's going on, because the reaction of the people in the cartoon is going to dictate it's going to point to probably what reaction the artist wants from the readers. Because if there's a crowd in the cartoon, it's likely that the crowd is effectively the reader as well, because you're taking in what's happening in the cartoon. Obviously, you might have a few different people within the cartoon. You might have a couple that are happy and a couple that are sad. And it's kind of the juxtaposition of those two different things that maybe incites a different feeling. But I think, it's just important to look at everything, even color schemes. You can say, okay, is this a really bright kind of warm picture? Is it a cold kind of dreary-ish picture? Even just the general tone of the colors. So if you've got reds and oranges and yellows, which kind of make it feel warm, but they're really, really bright, it might almost feel sharp. Whereas if you have kind of a duller red, orange, and yellow, it might just be more cozy and kind of comfy. Obviously, those are really weird words to try and use to explain cartoons, but hopefully people kind of understand what I'm saying when I say that. And, look at the text as well. If you know that you're someone that doesn't do well with just looking at photos or pictures and really extrapolating meaning from that, a lot of times, like Felicity said, there's signs, or there's speech bubbles, or there's even text underneath the photo that might give you just a little bit more information to try and kind of nudge you in the right direction. So, and a lot of times it's typically the cartoon's trying to do something. It's trying to make you feel something or think about something. So just try to figure out if you can come up with what that is, because that's usually what one or two of the questions is going to be about. But it's not easy. Again, exposure is probably key, which is hard because that takes time. And I'm sure, as everyone knows, time is very limited when you're studying for the GAMSAT, especially if you're doing other things on top. But again, just a few things every week, even reading the newspaper and looking at the political cartoons or any of that type of stuff in the back of the paper, it's just general exposure, and you'll get better and better and better. So next subject, we'll talk about fiction, and then we'll finish up with some nonfiction, and then we'll tie everything up. So you're almost there, guys. You're doing well. So fiction, this is very, very similar to poetry. So obviously poetry and fiction really kind of have quite a lot of ties together. So the best thing you can do is just get exposed to as many different types of fiction. So there's a lot of different types, and usually what this is about is it's an excerpt from a book, or from a play, or from a short story or something like that. And it can be anything. So you can do young adult, it can be fantasy, it can be an entire story. So you could have a 3-paragraph story as fiction as one of your questions. And the goal here really should be, again, knowing yourself and how you can approach questions. So whether that's reading the questions first and then going through the STEM quickly to try to find where that information is, or if it's just getting a really quick skim of the STEM, and then understanding the main points and themes as you go through. It's just all about understanding how you work best through questions. And unfortunately, too, how you work through questions may change based on what type of information you're given. So if it is fiction, a lot of times a fiction story is a lot easier to kind of separate bits and pieces. You don't really need the whole picture to try and understand what's going on, because you will have a story as such, but it's not going to be as important to understand every single line as much as it is if you're doing something like poetry. Because poetry, you may read just a couple lines, and every single line that you read is happy and talking about how great things are. And then when it asks you about the theme of the poem, you might say, oh, well, it was genuinely quite happy. But when you actually read the poem itself, you might have alternating lines. The first line is a happy thought, and the second line is a sad thought, and the third line is a happy, and then sad, and on and forth. And if all you've read is those happy lines based on the questions you've read, you might shoot yourself in the foot saying, oh, well, it's a generally happy, whereas the poem is actually talking about that kind of dichotomy of happy versus sad when they're transposed or interposed on top of each other. And this kind of duality of, anyway, a lot of other
the answer
things
is ambivalent in that question.
There you go. Ambivalence is always the answer. But yeah, the idea is practice reading things quickly, practice your own style, understand the main point and themes, and it's just exposure. Get a book if you want. Try to find a book that you're going to enjoy that's written in fiction and nonfiction as well, and cartoons and poetry. I know the list gets steadily longer and longer, but again, the longer you give yourself to study, and the kind of more you piece this out over 4 or 5 months, the better. And again, hopefully you guys have done some of this. You've read a bit in the past couple of years. I know in uni it's always difficult to find time to read for leisure. It's never feels like the right time to pick up a book, but maybe it is the right time. So what do you think, Felicity?
I think for fiction, your best resource, a book of high quality short stories. I can't stress enough that you need to be exposed to new words. Vocabulary is often the downfall of many people sitting in the GAMSAT, especially if you're from like English as a second language background. I think that can be really difficult. I really recommend buying a book. Often they have like top Australian short stories of 2021. They come out with one every single year. Buying that book and working your way through it. I say short stories because often with short stories, they try and pack more meaning and into the particular paragraph that you might be reading or something like that, because they only have a limited amount of words. So, and also your attention span will be grateful for it as well if you pick a short story book. And the other thing is classics as well. They do like to draw a couple things from classics, but I know those can be quite esoteric and difficult to make your way through. So yes, those are my points for fiction. And then for nonfiction, this is probably the most common sort of text you might receive in GAMSAT Section 1. It's often scientific or to do with a person. And I found that they also have quite a few ties to medicine as well. So that already gives you a kind of narrower scope to read widely around and familiarizing yourself with the language. And I think this was something that really benefited me. But if you did a previous science degree, you'll have obviously, hopefully, read some scientific journal articles. I think that helps so much with just familiarizing yourself with the way that they speak in scientific journal articles. If you are from a non-science background, I recommend reading in depth, like at least 2 or 3, just to start off with, so that you get in this sort of frame of mind where you are processing a lot of information at once, and you're able to pick out what's important and what isn't important as well. And then with the questions as well, the nonfiction questions are, I think, the easiest ones to answer because there are more definite answers within nonfiction. So as Nick said, they'll often refer to like in line 13, or they'll ask you specifically about it. I think the challenge with nonfiction is that they're also quite long pieces of text that they give you, and you have to find the specific piece of information that you're looking for. But once you've found it, underline it. Sometimes there'll be 2 references to the thing that you're looking for, so make sure you look at both of them, underline it, and then answer the question with that. Yeah. What about you, Nick?
Yeah, nonfiction is one of those things that it's really hard to kind of prepare for, other than again exposure, exposure, exposure. But I think it's one of those things that hopefully a lot of people through a science degree have seen a lot of nonfiction articles. So they've done scientific research. They've read breakdowns of how a science experiment has been run or how a case study has been formulated. And it might just be you need to sit down with a bunch of different research papers and read the abstract of each one, maybe read the kind of method and conclusion, and then just get an idea. Okay, did I understand that? Did I understand what the goal of the research paper was? Did I understand whether or not they kind of met their outcome, or whether or not they were, what their hypothesis was at the start or might have been, and then whether they proved that right or wrong. And understanding too that nonfiction is just something that's true. So again, it can be about a person's life. So it can be a biography excerpt. It can be a story about someone's life. It can be a story about the development of penicillin. It can be anything. So it's hard to really approach this much like fiction because it can literally be anything. But it's about being exposed to it and not being scared by stuff on the day. If you read plenty of journal articles, you get an idea of how they're generally set up and where the information lies and where the important stuff is. Like a lot of times when you're reading a journal article, the method itself isn't as important if you're just trying to find out what they did and what the outcome was. The method is more talking about their step-by-step process of collecting the data and what they did to kind of make sure that it was collected in a sufficient way. Whereas you kind of think if it's a published article, the likelihood is that their method is sound and they haven't kind of cut any corners anywhere. So there's things that you can kind of, and obviously that's not always the case. So still read the method when you're doing it.
Contentious, Nick.
But the idea is in the GAMSAT, again, they're not trying to trick you. They're not trying to throw information at you that isn't real or is malingering or factitious. So the idea is just expose yourself to this stuff, get better at reading it quickly, understand how your brain works, whether or not, and again, you can change your setup. You may know that for poetry, you need to have a good read of the poem before you can actually answer the question. So if you see poetry, approach the question that way. You may know with nonfiction that you can get the gist just by reading a couple lines or by looking at the questions first and then skimming the text for what you're looking for. again, it's hard, but this is one of those things, and this is why I think this podcast is relatively important too, because a lot of people neglect section 1 and 2 because they are focused so much on section 3. And so the earlier you start getting some exposure to this stuff, getting good at reading, getting quick. And I think Felicity made a really good point too about the fact that just general vocabulary is really, really important for section 1 and section 2 at that, because a lot of the things they ask you is, what does this word mean? Or what is the best, definition for this word within the text? And you don't need to know that word specifically, because a lot of times they're asking you about a word that is either really complicated so that you would never use in everyday language, or it has multiple different meanings depending on the context clues surrounding that word. And so your goal is to say, okay, that's the word that I'm looking for. Let me read around it to try and figure out how they're utilizing it in this instance. And just general vocab will be very, very useful for this section.
The worst feeling is when you get to a question and you've got 4 answers and they're like, what is the feeling of this text? And you don't recognize one of the words in the answers. And you're like, it could be that, but I literally have no idea what that word means. And you're like, okay, I'm just going to choose the next best one. Like, obviously don't choose, well, in my opinion, don't choose something that you don't know unless you've ruled out the other 3. But yeah, it can be a real annoying waste of a question if you just don't understand one of the answers.
Absolutely. But all right, well, I think that kind of tidies everything up. Obviously, like I said, that's by no means an exhaustive list, so try to have a bit of more research and see what else you might come across on the day. But it's always good just to start practicing early, because again, section 1 is one of those things that it can really sneak up on you, and if you're only starting a month before the exam, it can get very, very crunchy when it comes up towards the time of the exam, and you will kick yourself if you do really, really well on section 3 and you realize that your score for section 1 either isn't what you'd hope for, or it's even below that 50 mark, and it therefore means that section 3 score doesn't really get you anything. So don't neglect it, but also stay positive throughout.
If you need extra help, you can always go to GradReady and do one of our courses online. We have lots, like thousands and thousands of questions that we can help you do as well if you're not into wide reading and you kind of just want the questions there to practice. So definitely recommend checking that out on our website. Thanks so much, guys.
Absolutely. All right. Good luck with the study, everyone. So hopefully if you're listening to this, you are in the study of GAMSAT, and keep your ears out for the next podcast.
Don't neglect section 1.
Or section 2.
Or section 2.